My name is Jamie Lewis, and I am 25 years old. When people talk about childhood bonds, they usually mean the kind you're born into, the ones sealed by blood and last names. But the truth is, the strongest bond I ever had was forged by circumstance timing and two lonely girls who didn't know yet how easily love could turn into rivalry. Charlotte wasn't my biological sister, but for most of my life, that distinction felt meaningless. Our parents married when I was 9 and she was 8, though by then she already felt familiar like a person I had known in fragments long before she officially became part of my life. We had met years earlier when my mom started dating her dad, and I remember being 6 years old, standing at the window whenever their car pulled into our driveway, excitement buzzing through me because it meant I wouldn't be alone that evening. I didn't grow up with siblings. My biological father cheated on my mother while she was pregnant with me, and when he was caught, he didn't fight, didn't beg, didn't even pretend. He signed away his rights and disappeared with the woman he'd betrayed my mother with, leaving behind nothing but a blank space where a father should have been. My grandparents had money enough that my mom refused child support just to sever all ties with him completely. So I grew up without a dad, without stories about him, without even the bitterness of memories. He was just absent, a concept, not a person. Charlotte's story was different, but no less lonely. Her mother died when she was very young, her body worn down by multiple health issues that pregnancy had only worsened. By the time Charlotte could form clear memories, her mom was already gone. Her dad raised her alone until he met my mother, and when our families blended, something quietly beautiful happened. Two adults who had lost partners found stability again, and two little girls who had grown up missing something essential suddenly had each other. From the outside, it probably looked idyllic. From the inside, it felt like survival. Charlotte and I were close in a way that only children forced into shared space can be. We shared toys, secrets, and eventually a bedroom. We whispered in the dark about our fears about our parents, about what it might feel like to grow up and not feel broken anymore. She was bold where I was cautious, confident where I was self-conscious, but I admired that about her. She made me feel braver just by existing near me. My stepdad became my first real father figure. He showed up consistently, quietly, without expecting praise for it. He went to my school events, taught me how to ride a bike properly, helped with homework when my mom worked late. Watching him with Charlotte made me feel included, not like an outsider borrowing someone else's family. For a long time, I believed we were lucky. Blended families are supposed to be messy, but ours felt almost gentle. That illusion held through middle school. Charlotte had started school early, so despite being a year younger than me, we ended up in the same grade. We walked the same hallways, shared the same classes, rolled our eyes at the same teachers. Teachers often mistook us for real sisters, and we never corrected them. Why would we? It felt easier to let the world believe what we already felt at home. Everything shifted the year we started high school, though. I didn't realize it at the time. Changes like that never announce themselves. They slip in quietly disguised as something harmless, like a new student or an extra chair in class. His name was Noah. His family had just moved to town, and from the first day he stood out, not because he was loud or flashy, but because he was kind in a way that felt rare at 15. He smiled easily, laughed without trying to impress anyone, and talked to people like they mattered. I noticed him immediately. So did Charlotte. I could feel it in the way her posture changed when he walked into the room, in the way she suddenly cared more about how she looked before school. At first, it felt almost funny. We were teenagers. Crushes came and went, usually lasting no longer than a season. We had both dated other boys before, but those relationships felt more like rehearsals than anything real. Noah was different, though, and I think we both knew it. There was a gravity to him, something that pulled you in quietly instead of demanding attention. I remember sitting on my bed one night, legs crossed, Charlotte beside me, both of us pretending to study while really just circling the same unspoken topic. Eventually, I brought it up. I told her I thought I liked him. She hesitated for half a second too long before admitting she did too. The air between us shifted thick with something fragile. We talked for hours that night. We were so earnest, so desperate to do the right thing. We promised each other that neither of us would make a move on Noah, that we wouldn't let a boy come between us. It felt noble, mature, like we were choosing family over hormones. We shook on it, laughed nervously afterward, convinced that the crush would fade. But life doesn't respect teenage promises made in good faith. Because we shared classes with Noah, friendship happened naturally. The three of us became inseparable, studying together, walking home together, sitting in the same lunch spot every day. The more time I spent with him, the harder it became to pretend my feelings were shallow. He listened when I spoke. He remembered small things. He teased me gently, the kind that made your stomach flutter instead of hurt. And even when he flirted, I held back. Every instinct told me to lean in, but guilt kept pulling me away. Charlotte and I never talked about him again. Not at home, not in whispers. It became an unspoken rule, a silent truce. I assumed she was doing the same thing I was suppressing, waiting it out, choosing us over him. I wanted to believe that so badly that I didn't question it. By junior year, Noah's attention toward me wasn't subtle anymore. He'd linger when we talked, find excuses to sit next to me, look at me like he was waiting for something I refused to give. I told myself it was harmless, that ignoring it was the right thing to do, that loyalty meant sacrifice. Prom season loomed in senior year like a ticking clock, and even then I thought we'd survive it. I nearly said yes to another guy, convincing myself it would simplify everything. But beneath that logic was a quiet dread, a sense that something unresolved was about to surface whether I was ready or not. I didn't know it yet, but the promise Charlotte and I had made, the one I'd been honoring with everything I had, was already broken. I just hadn't seen the cracks forming beneath it. And cracks, once they start, don't stop on their own. I found out the truth on a day that should have been completely ordinary, which somehow made it worse. It was late afternoon, the halls already thinning, as people drifted home or to practice when Noah stopped me near the lockers. He looked different, nervous almost, and that alone made my stomach tighten. Noah was usually confident in a quiet way, the kind of person who didn't waste energy on uncertainty. That day, though, he kept rubbing the back of his neck, glancing around as if he was afraid of being overheard. "Jamie," he said, lowering his voice, "I need to talk to you, alone." I followed him without thinking. We ended up outside, sitting on the low concrete wall near the parking lot where teachers never seemed to look. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he took a breath, steadying himself, and everything changed. He told me Charlotte had asked him to prom. Not just asked, confessed. Told him she had feelings for him. Told him she wanted more than friendship. I felt the blood drain from my face so fast it made me dizzy. My first instinct was disbelief, followed quickly by something sharp and painful that cut through my chest. I waited for him to say it was a joke or a misunderstanding, but he didn't. He just kept talking, explaining how uncomfortable it had made him, how conflicted he'd felt about telling me at all. She promised me she wouldn't. I heard myself say, though, I wasn't sure if I was speaking to him or to the memory of that night in our shared bedroom, shaking hands and nervous laughter. Then he said something that hit even harder. I turned her down. I looked at him, startled. "She's always been flirty with me," he admitted, choosing his words carefully. "For years. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured she'd grow out of it. But I didn't feel the same way. I never did." There was a pause. He looked directly at me, then his eyes serious. "I like you, Jamie. I have for a long time." The world narrowed to just the two of us sitting there. The hum of distant traffic, the sound of lockers slamming somewhere inside the building, it all faded. He told me he was tired of pretending, that he didn't want to graduate without knowing where we stood. He said he needed an answer, not because he wanted to pressure me, but because he needed clarity. If I didn't feel the same, he'd accept it and move on. I nodded numbly, asking for a day to think, even though part of me already knew the truth. Still knowing and admitting are two very different things. I skipped my last classes that day. I couldn't stand the thought of walking home with Charlotte, of pretending everything was normal when my chest felt like it was collapsing in on itself. When I got home, I went straight to my room and waited. Every sound in the house felt amplified. The front door opening, her footsteps on the stairs. She walked in like it was any other day, tossed her bag aside, started talking about something trivial, her voice light, careless. She didn't mention Noah, didn't mention prom, didn't mention the promise we had made. That hurt more than I expected. I confronted her before I could lose my nerve, asked her if it was true, asked her if she'd asked Noah out. Her reaction was immediate and explosive. "That's none of your business," she snapped, her face hardening. "What happens between me and Noah doesn't involve you." I stared at her, stunned. "It does when you promised me you wouldn't do this." She scoffed. "I made that promise to spare your feelings. Don't act like you're innocent here." The words felt like a slap. Years of trust cracked open in that moment, spilling everything I'd been holding back. I told her about my feelings for him, about how hard it had been to ignore him, about how I'd done it anyway because I thought she mattered more. I told her I loved him. Saying it out loud felt terrifying and freeing all at once. She laughed, actually laughed. "You really thought he'd choose you?" she said. "Be serious, Jamie." That was it. Whatever restraint I'd been clinging to shattered completely. The fight that followed was ugly, loud, and raw in a way I'd never experienced before. Old resentments surfaced things neither of us had admitted, even to ourselves. By the end of it, I knew something irreversible had happened. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I told Noah everything about the promise, about the fight, about how long I'd been lying to myself. He listened without interrupting his expression, steady, grounded. When I finished, he told me he was willing to wait to give me time. "I don't want to be the reason you lose your family," he said softly. But I'd already lost something, or maybe I'd just finally seen it clearly. "I don't want to wait," I told him. "I don't want to pretend anymore." We started dating that day. The fallout was immediate. Charlotte moved into the basement, taking her things with a finality that made it clear she didn't intend to come back. We stopped speaking entirely. Our parents noticed, of course, but neither of us explained. Silence felt easier than reopening wounds we didn't know how to heal. College put physical distance between us, which helped. Noah and I went to the same school. Charlotte went across the country. Time passed, life happened, and eventually the anger dulled into something quieter, less sharp. But even as years went by, I never forgot the way it felt to realize the person I trusted most had been willing to sacrifice me first. And deep down, I suspected that wounds left untreated don't disappear. They wait. Distance has a way of turning sharp pain into something duller, easier to carry, and college did exactly that for me. When Charlotte left for a school across the country and Noah and I stayed close, it felt like the universe had quietly rearranged itself to make things survivable. I didn't have to see her every day, didn't have to tiptoe around shared spaces or shared memories. I could finally breathe without feeling like I was stealing something that wasn't meant to be mine. Noah and I grew together in those years. College stripped away the awkwardness of our teenage selves and replaced it with something steadier. We learned how to argue without tearing each other down, how to support each other when stress piled up, how to sit in silence and still feel connected. The guilt I'd once carried about choosing him slowly faded, replaced by the certainty that love shouldn't feel like punishment. Charlotte existed mostly on the periphery of my life then. Holidays, occasional family gatherings, the brief updates our parents would share over dinner. At first, those moments were tense. Polite smiles, stiff hellos, carefully chosen words. But as time went on, the hostility softened. We never addressed what had happened, not really, but we stopped actively avoiding each other. We learned how to coexist. By the time we all graduated and started working, our fight felt distant, like something that had happened to different versions of us. Charlotte started dating someone seriously, a guy she'd met in college. When she told me, I congratulated her, and I meant it. I wanted her to be happy. Maybe I also wanted proof that the past was truly behind us. Her wedding invitation arrived the following year. Holding it in my hands stirred up feelings I hadn't expected: nostalgia, sadness, acceptance, all tangled together. When we were kids, we used to play pretend weddings, declaring each other maids of honor with dramatic flair. Standing at her real wedding as just another guest felt like a quiet goodbye to the sisterhood we'd once shared. I didn't bring Noah. It felt kinder that way. Even though Charlotte insisted she'd moved on, I didn't want to test that claim on her wedding day. She noticed, of course, and told me afterward that I could have brought him, that it didn't matter anymore. I smiled, nodded, took her words at face value. I shouldn't have. A few months later, Noah proposed. It was simple, perfect, exactly right for us. We were both in good places. Him freshly promoted me, stepping into a new chapter with a startup my friend and I were building together. I imagined a calm engagement, a wedding focused on joy instead of tension. When I invited Charlotte, she accepted without hesitation, congratulating me warmly. I took that as a sign. Maybe we'd finally grown past everything. The week of the wedding arrived in a blur of logistics and excitement. The venue was a hotel just outside town, and most of our close family and friends stayed there with us. Charlotte and her husband were supposed to arrive the day before the ceremony, but they showed up the same day we did instead. It threw me off briefly, but they brushed it off as a scheduling mix-up, and I didn't question it. Why would I? I wanted peace too badly. Looking back, that was the moment I should have paid attention. On the morning of my wedding, the air buzzed with anticipation. I was in my room getting my makeup done when I noticed Charlotte lingering outside in the hallway. It struck me as odd. She wasn't a bridesmaid. She wasn't my mother. She had no reason to be hovering there, peeking in and out like she was waiting for something. I told myself I was being paranoid. Once I was ready, my bridesmaids and my mom left to get dressed themselves. There was an hour left before the ceremony, and my nerves were starting to get the better of me. I decided to take a short walk down the corridor to clear my head, careful not to stray far or let anyone see me in my dress. That's when Charlotte stepped in front of me. She said she needed to talk, that it was important. Something in her tone made my chest tighten. We hadn't had a real conversation in years, not one that mattered. But curiosity and maybe old habit won out, and I followed her a few steps away from my door. What she told me next was so calculated, so deliberately timed, that it took me a moment to even process the words. She claimed she'd arrived early on purpose, that Noah had asked her to, that he'd contacted her weeks ago confessing doubts, confessing feelings, asking her to run away with him. She spoke softly, like she was doing me a favor, like she was protecting me. I listened without interrupting, my face calm, even as something cold settled in my stomach. I knew she was lying. Not because I wanted to believe Noah blindly, but because the story didn't fit him. It didn't fit us. He wasn't cruel, and he wasn't a coward. So I let her finish. And then I made a decision. I didn't react the way Charlotte expected me to. I didn't gasp or cry or stumble backward like a woman whose world had just collapsed. I stood there in the hallway in my wedding dress, hands folded loosely in front of me, listening to her weave the story she'd clearly rehearsed 100 times. She spoke about Noah's supposed fear about secret messages and late-night confessions about how he had realized too late that he was in love with her instead. She said my name gently, as if she were delivering bad news out of kindness rather than cruelty. The longer she talked, the clearer it became that this wasn't about Noah at all. This was about timing, about humiliation, about control. She finished by telling me she hadn't wanted to tell me this way, but that she couldn't let me walk into a marriage built on lies. The irony almost made me laugh. I thanked her. The words slipped out before she could stop herself from smiling. That smile, brief, triumphant, told me everything I needed to know. She thought she'd won. She thought I was about to unravel. Instead, I pulled my phone from the small clutch I'd been carrying and turned slightly away from her, angling the screen so she couldn't see it. My hands were steady as I opened Instagram and tapped on her husband's name. I didn't have his number saved, but I didn't need it. When he answered, I let my voice shake just enough to sound convincing. I repeated Charlotte's story almost word for word, framing it as something I'd just been told and couldn't understand. I asked if he knew anything about it, asked if it made sense to him. Behind me, Charlotte watched closely, her expression tightening as the seconds passed. She probably assumed I was calling Noah, confronting him, giving her exactly what she wanted. Then her husband spoke. His confusion was immediate and loud enough that I didn't have to exaggerate it. He told me he had no idea what I was talking about, that he and Charlotte had arrived late because of an argument, not a secret plan, that if Noah had contacted her, he'd never heard about it. I put the phone on speaker. The sound of his voice echoing in the hallway shattered the illusion Charlotte had built. She froze, her face draining of color as realization set in. She started yelling, accusing me of trying to sabotage her marriage, of twisting things, of being cruel on purpose. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I'm doing to you exactly what you tried to do to me, I said calmly. The difference is, I'm telling the truth. I ended the call and walked back into my room, closing the door behind me before she could follow. My bridesmaids stared at me, alarmed, as I explained what had just happened. I told them I didn't want Charlotte anywhere near the ceremony. Not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. As it turned out, I didn't have to worry. The ceremony went on without interruption. Charlotte never showed up. Our parents noticed her absence, but no one pressed the issue. I walked down the aisle, married the man I loved, and felt nothing but certainty. Later, I learned she had checked out of the hotel during the ceremony. And in that silence she left behind, I felt something unexpected relief. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly through phone calls that went unanswered and messages that carried a strange, brittle tone. Noah and I tried to stay wrapped in the glow of being newly married, but reality has a way of seeping in through the cracks no matter how tightly you hold on to happiness. 2 days after the wedding, my parents called. They didn't ask how I was doing. They didn't congratulate us again or comment on the ceremony. Instead, they told me that Charlotte and her husband were separating, and then, without pausing long enough for me to process, that they told me it was my fault. Apparently, her husband had called them in a rage, accusing Charlotte of humiliating him, of obsessing over Noah, of deliberately arriving early to sabotage my wedding. He'd told them everything. About the hallway confrontation, about the phone call, about how long he'd suspected she wasn't truly invested in their marriage. According to my parents, Charlotte had refused to leave his house afterward, forcing him to threaten calling the police just to get her out. And somehow, in their version of events, my role eclipsed hers. They said I shouldn't have dragged her husband into it, that I should have protected her marriage, even if she hadn't protected mine. That by making that call, I had crossed a line. When I told them I refused to apologize, the line went dead. They stopped speaking to me entirely. Our honeymoon should have been pure joy. Instead, it was threaded with guilt and confusion. Not because I believed I'd done something wrong, but because losing my parents' support hurt in a way I hadn't anticipated. Cutting off friends who sided with Charlotte was easier. I hadn't realized how conditional some of those friendships were until they vanished the moment things got uncomfortable. But my parents were different. I miss my mom's voice. I miss my stepdad's dry humor. I miss the sense of belonging I'd once felt so secure in. Still, I held my ground. I wasn't going to apologize for defending myself. On the third day of our honeymoon, I received a text from my mother. I didn't open it. I wanted to preserve the fragile happiness Noah and I were building at least for a little while longer. We laughed, explored, held hands like nothing else mattered. I told myself I could deal with disappointment later. When we returned home, jet-lagged and sunburned, and still riding the last echoes of joy, I finally opened the message. My mother admitted they'd been wrong. Charlotte had stayed with them briefly after separating from her husband, and during that time, all she'd done was badmouth me, twisting events, replaying old grudges, refusing to take responsibility. Eventually, even my stepdad had reached his limit. They realized too late that Charlotte's behavior hadn't changed, that what she'd done at my wedding wasn't a mistake or a lapse in judgment, but a continuation of something deeply unresolved. They asked me to come over for dinner. They said they wanted to apologize. I cried when I read that message, not because everything was suddenly okay, but because being seen finally clearly felt like a weight lifting off my chest. Noah hugged me while I cried, telling me he was proud of me for not giving in when it would have been easier to do so. We agreed to the dinner. I know things won't ever be exactly the way they were. Trust once fractured doesn't magically reassemble itself. But I also know this: I chose myself when it mattered. I chose honesty over comfort boundaries, over appeasement and love that doesn't ask me to disappear. And this time I don't regret it.